I want to thank you so much for the introduction and apologize for technology being technical as it likes to be. I'm very honored to have been invited to participate in this series of lectures about research work at Deir el-Bahari. This afternoon, I'm going to tell you about a research project that has occupied me off and on for the past 50 years since I first came to Egypt, interested in the social history of the Third Intermediate Period, especially the 22nd to 25th dynasties, about 943 to 654 BC, when the rulers of Egypt were of Libyan and Kushite origin. My particular focus has been on the priests of the Theban god Montu, who seemingly favored burial near the temple of Nebhebet-re-Mentuhotep at Deir el-Bahari, which was dedicated to Montu and Montu-Ra when it was built. Before I deal more specifically with one group of coffins discovered by Baraize at Deir el-Bahari, I would like to provide some context for this collection of coffins. The West Bank at Thebes is one of the richest archaeological sites in the world. The temples of Nebhebet-re-Mentuhotep II, Hatshepsut, and Tutmosis III, on the right side of the slide, dominate the landscape. The vast necropolis contained burials stretching over some 3 millennia of ancient Egyptian history. When the cults of the 18th dynasty pharaohs no longer functioned by about 1000 BC, the empty space of the temples was gradually populated by burials during the Third Intermediate Period. Some of these burials ended up in famous caches of coffins in the shadow of the pyramid-shaped peak, the Corn, sacred to the goddess Hathor. 3 of the most famous caches of the Third Intermediate Period are associated with Deir el-Bahari: the Royal Mummies cache at DB 320, the 25th dynasty cache of coffins of priests of Montu, and the cache of coffins of 21st dynasty priests and priestesses of Amun at Bab el-Gussus. The cache of 60 coffins of priests of Montu was discovered by the French photographer Monnier in 1858 in 9 shafts in and or in front of the Hathor Chapel, more or less as far as we can determine the area of the red arrow on the plan, which shows what parts of the temple were viewable at that time. Marriott's assistant, Vasali, drew some of them. Some of the coffins and stelae sent to the Boulak Museum were published by Marriott in his album De Musée de Boulak in 1872. You see the cover in the center. In 1913, 2 volumes of the Cairo Catalogue Général by Gauthier and Moret were devoted to the coffins. The cache is the largest collection of 25th dynasty coffins in the world. The museum number 666, attached to the stele of Ankef and Khonsu on the lower right, gave it a magical significance to Alistair Crowley. Already in 1855, the French consul, Raymond Sabatier, had obtained a firman to excavate at Deir el-Bahari, and he engaged Monnier for the fieldwork. His collection, sold in Paris in 1890, included objects related to the priest of Montu families, including the coffins of Bessenmout, now in the British Museum, and of a daughter of Takalat III, now in the Louvre, on the left-hand side of the slide. A few years later, the Irish Lord Dufferin, later Governor General of Canada and Viceroy of India, on a youthful adventure trip to Egypt, engaged in digging at the site of the Nebhebet-Ra temple dedicated to Montu, although he apparently did not find any 25th dynasty coffins belonging to the priests. The work was supervised by his Egyptian rise, Mohammed Hossein, and Cyril Graham, who left a dig diary, of which typescript is now in the British Museum. Most of Dufferin's finds, including reliefs from the temple, are still at his estate in Northern Ireland, Clandeboy, where they're built into the walls. The cache of coffins containing the royal mummies was officially discovered in 1881, having been looted for the previous decade by the Abdul Rasul brothers, who had found it. Abdul Rasul, the brothers are shown on the top left, also indicated the spot where the Baba Gussu's cache was discovered in 1891 to Grabo. It's at the northeast corner of the courtyard of the Hatshepsut temple, in the center of the plan on the lower right. It contained 254 coffins of 21st dynasty priests and priestesses of Amun, the largest cache ever discovered in Egypt. The unfinished early 18th dynasty queen's tomb that sheltered the cache, perhaps originally intended for Hatshepsut as queen, lies beneath the first court of the Deir el-Bahari temple of Hatshepsut. The major excavations at Deir el-Bahari were conducted by Edward Neville for the Egypt Exploration Fund at both the Hatshepsut and Montu temples sites from 1893 to 1906. Howard Carter was engaged as an artist to copy the inscriptions that appear in the published volumes. When Neville began work, the area was covered with mounds of debris, much of it rockfall and alluvial rainwash from the Gebel around the temples, and mud brick from the Coptic monastery that was built on top of the walls of the upper court of Hatshepsut's temple. Even when cleared of debris, much of the temple lay in ruins, as you can see in the center slide. In the course of his excavations, Neville uncovered the intact shaft tomb of 3 persons related to the priests of Montu, who favored this area for their burials in the 25th dynasty. It was located in the northwest corner of the hypostyle hall of the Hathor Chapel. The coffin sets are now divided between Oxford, Boston, and New York. Note the wooden jackal and falcon figures on the lids of the rectangular outermost Khersut coffins. Unfortunately, Patrick has not been able to rediscover where this shaft is. It seems to have disappeared under a wall somewhere during the reconstruction of the temple. The Metropolitan Museum of Art excavations at the site of Deir el-Bahari continued for 20 years, from 1911 to 1931. The last decade in charge of Herbert Winlock, whose annual reports are a valuable record of the excavations. He at times had over 400 men working clearing debris around the temple, and you see the crew at work in the upper left. The director of works of the Egyptian Antiquities Department, Emile Baraize, was responsible for most of the architectural restoration, while Winlock concentrated on excavation and reassembling the fragments of smashed statuary. At the end of their work, most of the upper terrace still remained unreconstructed, as you can see on the right. Baraize searched under the flooring for additional blocks for his reconstruction, and this led to the discovery we will be discussing today. It's marked by the red arrow in the slide. It was in a shaft in the vestibule in front of the chapel of Hatshepsut on the southern side of the upper court. Baraize died 73 years ago this month, 19 years after the discovery of the Baraize tomb in the winter of 1932-1933. Baraize unfortunately never published any account of his discovery and did not leave any records about it, not even the location of the tomb shaft. The challenge has been to trace the objects and try to reconstruct the archaeological context. The site of the shaft lay below the tower of the Coptic monastery in the upper left corner. It was originally the vestibule of the chapel of Hatshepsut at the south end of the upper terrace at Deir el-Bahari, in the circle on the right. The area is still used as a work area by the Polish Egyptian mission and is not accessible to the public. The vestibule had also been used for Christian burials, and 2 tombs of the 4th to 5th century Coptic anchorites were excavated by the Polish Egyptian mission in the chapel of Hatshepsut and the adjoining vestibule, marked A and B on the slide. They must have been known to Baraize or his predecessors, since they contained backfill debris. The earliest announcement of Baraize's discovery appeared in the New York Times on March 26, 1933, in an article that was datelined Cairo, March 3rd. This is the closest we can get to the actual date of the discovery. It was described as a cache, although unlike the 3 other famous caches from Deir el-Bahari that I mentioned above, it contained only 4 coffin sets, 2 belonging to priests of Montu and 2 belonging to women assumed to have been somehow related to them. although there's no evidence of their relationship. The New York Times article was reprinted in the Montreal Gazette on April 10th. Oops, sorry. We have come to call it the Baraize Tomb, is a shorthand way of identifying it. The first scientific announcement appeared in the Belgian journal Chronique d'Égypte in July 1933, authored by Henri Gauthier. He added some further details about the contents of the tomb, underlined on the lower right of the slide. They were shabti boxes and shabtis, 4 Tazhok or Osiris figures, and the wooden statuettes of falcons and the jackal Anubis that adorned the corner posts and lids of the outermost rectangular coffins. Interestingly, there were 8 of the jackal figures, whereas normally only 1 was placed on the lid. The question is, did half of them come from 4 other coffin sets from some other shaft? We don't know, and all of these figures have now disappeared. As there were also some cartonnage masks, possibly of Ptolemaic date, and some Coptic objects reported, we're uncertain whether they fell into the partly open shaft at some later time or even backfill from Baraize's work. The same report appeared in the first number of the French journal Revue d'Egyptologie, published in September 1933. Excerpts were copied in the French newspaper Comédia for September 3rd, 1933, with some mistakes probably due to handwriting and accurate copying from the Revue d'Egyptologie text. Otherwise, so far as I've been able to find, there were no other contemporary announcements of this discovery, although it was considered an important one at the time. The reconstruction of a 25th dynasty Khersu set shown on the right, also belonging to a priest of Montu, which was purchased for the British Museum in 1880, was perhaps also from the Deir el-Bahari area. It shows the components of a Khersu set, a rectangular outer Khersu coffin with falcons on the corner post and a recumbent jackal representing Anubis and a crouching falcon representing Sokar on the center of the lid. Inside were 2 nested osieriform coffins, the outer one having little decoration on its plain wood surface, and the inner one plastered, decorated with a rich assortment of funerary texts on a painted background and varnished. Inside was a mummy wrapped in linen with a bead net stretched over the bandages. Some, if not all of these coffin sets were accompanied by a painted wooden stela placed along the side or at the foot of the Khersu inside the burial chamber. There were also a pair of shabti boxes, usually with a boat painted on each lid, containing over 400 small, uninscribed blue faience or mud shabtis. There was also a chest containing the canopic jars, holding the soft tissues removed from the body during embalming, and a wooden Tazhok or Osiris statuette, which might have had a papyrus concealed in its back or base. That's at the right end of the slide there. After the Baraize discovery, it's not known where the objects from the tomb were stored. At least 2 objects were probably stolen from whatever magazine was used. One of the 4 Tazhok or Osiris statuettes from the Baraize tomb was sold at auction in New York in 1952 and can no longer be traced. The other 3 said to have been in the tomb cannot now be located, so they too may have disappeared into private collections. After the announcements in 1933, the discovery is not mentioned again until 1956, 23 years later, when Bruyère published his report following the death of his good friend Baraize in 1952. The report is mostly concerned with questions of genealogy and has little description of the objects, some of which were illustrated in the accompanying plates. Some of the genealogical information was later corrected the same year by Case. An attempt to smuggle the outer osieriform coffin of one of the women, Paracenas, was apparently foiled at an unknown date after 1956, and it too must have been taken from whatever magazine it was stored in. The coffin, shown here in the only known photograph, published with Bruyère's 1956 report, ended up in the Museum of Seized Objects in the Citadel, where it was noticed at some later time by members of the Bonn Totenbook project and mentioned in their database. It has recently been transferred to the Egyptian Museum, and we are awaiting permission to study and photograph it for the forthcoming publication of the Baraize Tomb. A family tree can be reconstructed from the information on the Baraize Tomb coffins and other documents. 3 of the burials belong to Padi Amenet III, grandson of the 23rd dynasty Libyan ruler Taklot III, and his nephew Nespekashuti VI, both priests of Montu, and a woman, Hera Senes, granddaughter of a vizier Jedhansefant B, fragments of whose Kersu coffin may have been found in the recently excavated shafts in the Hathor Chapel. This is awaiting confirmation with further study. The other woman, Tashayu, may have been the same person as the mother of Irti Eru, buried in Theban Tomb 390, excavated by the South Asasif project. The relationship of the 2 women to the 2 priests of Montu cannot be confirmed. Other monuments of the period from Deir el-Bahari, including coffins from the Montu priest coffin cache discovered at Deir el-Bahari in 1858, and coffins from the Sabatier collection, have allowed the reconstruction of this family tree covering the 23rd to 25th dynasties in Thebes, confirming that this area was favored by this extended family of viziers and Montu priests for their burials from about 780 to 650 BC. The family is related by marriage to daughters of the 23rd dynasty pharaoh Taklot III, who perhaps solidified his power by arranging marriages with an important Theban family. This family includes several viziers and the last attested Egyptian viceroy of Kush. Fragments of the cartonnage of the vizier Padi Amenet II, who's sort of in the center of the slide to the right of Taklot III's name, were found, to the left of Taklot III's name, were found by the Polish Egyptian mission in a tomb shaft inside the Hatshepsut chapel. It's perhaps no accident that the later generations included priests of Montu who are known to have supported the Kushite rulers in Thebes. About 12 years ago, all that remains of the coffin set of the second woman from the Baraize tomb, Tashayu, was located in the Carter magazine in Luxor. The single long side of her outer rectangular Kersu coffin and the Shabti boxes are in very poor condition. It is not known whether this was their condition when discovered or resulted from poor storage conditions at some later date. I first saw the 3 inner coffins known from the Baraize find in 1975 in a storeroom waiting to be transferred to the Luxor Museum, which opened later that year. That was the beginning of my 50-year journey with these coffins. In 1982, Lanny Bell, then director of Chicago House, and the Egyptian scholar Labib Habashi were photographed examining the outer osiriform coffin of Padi Amenet III in Theban Tomb 33, which was used as a magazine by the Antiquities Department. I saw and photographed this coffin in the mid-1980s, and you can see in the left side there looking at a big footpiece of the coffin, and on the right slide is my photograph a few years later of the same footpiece. By the mid-1990s, this coffin and the outer osiriform coffin of Padi Amenet III's nephew, Nespekashuti VI, which was stored lying next to it in Theban Tomb 33, had been transferred to the magazine of the Luxor Museum, where they remain today. On the footpiece shown in both photos, the title of the Viceroy of Kush in Padi Amenet III's ancestry is shown in the 3rd column from the right. In 1976, I learned that the Kersu coffins from the Baraize tomb were stored in the tomb of Nefru at Deir el-Bahari. This was the 11th dynasty queen of Mentuhotep II, where I was permitted to photograph them. Note the predominantly yellow background color, characteristic of the burial equipment from this shaft, which may be an indication of the status of this group of priests as well. Although the Kersu of Herasenes was in fairly good condition, some restoration is visible, especially on the corner post at the foot end on the right and on the floor. You can maybe just see beneath the coffin, there's kind of a yellow band. That's a modern piece of wood. There's no record of when or by whom this was undertaken or of the materials used. When I was permitted to enter the TT33 magazine in the 1980s to photograph the outer Osiriform coffins of Padi Amenet and Nespekashuti, I was also fortunate enough to locate, by chance, and photograph some of the Shabti boxes from the Baraize Tomb, which were in very poor condition, as you can see from the photos on the left I took at the time. The Shabti box in the center belongs to Heras Enes, whose Kersu we've just looked at. She was the daughter of a woman named Tasha Hepper. The coffins from the Baraize Tomb have had an adventurous life. They've been moved from place to place several times that we know of, and perhaps even more often between 1933 and 1975. At various points in their travels, different restoration efforts were undertaken. When the inner coffin and mummy of Herasenes were in the Luxor Museum, the museum curators patiently restored the bead net. You can see it before restoration in the lower photograph. Covering her mummy. The coffin and mummy are now in a magazine at the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Cairo. When the inner coffin of Herasenes was opened, it was discovered that a sheet of papyrus had been placed beneath her head. It turned out to contain the text of spell 162 from the Book of the Dead. The papyrus sheet is now in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It's included in the Bonn Totenbook Project database. According to Quirk, BD 162 is part of a series of 4 additions to the Book of the Dead during the Third Intermediate period. The sky cow asks for warmth to be placed under the head of the deceased. It appears in the Book of the Dead papyrus of the Montu priest Nespasefi and may have spread throughout this community before it became widespread during the later first millennium BC. Such papyri placed under the head seem to be the predecessors of later hypocephaly, amuletic discs, which were placed under the head of the deceased in the Ptolemaic period. There are very few examples of this type of papyrus that are known, and this is the only one that shows it in situ in the coffin. So another good piece of information from the Baraize Tomb. Prompted by my trying to find if there was more evidence of the Montu priest coffins discovered in 1858 or the Baraize group found in 1933, the Polish-Egyptian mission began investigating the niches and paving in the upper terrace at Deir el-Bahari, which they had not done before that. And eventually they discovered 17 shaft tombs in the Northwest Chapel of Amun, the Sanctuary of Amun, and the Royal Cult Complex, which are shown on this plan. In the Northwest Chapel of Amun were fragments of the Kersu coffin from another priest of Montu family from the same period. Shafts in the Chapel of Hatshepsut, shown in the plan, had cartonnage and coffin fragments belonging to the ancestors of the Montu priests from the Baraize Tomb. Some of the cartonnage fragments in the backfill in the shafts belong to the vizier Padi Amenet II. The more complete back of the cartonnage, discovered by Baraize in 1933 and mentioned in Bruyère's report, was located in about 2010 in the magazine of the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization in Fustad. On the right-hand side, you see a reconstruction drawing of the front of this cartonnage, and in the center is a photo of the pieces with the name and title fit together. This is research by Frederic Perraudot. Linden fragments from the same shafts named the vizier and the year 27 of a king whose prenomen was Usermaat Ra. most probably Osorkon III of the 23rd dynasty, rather than the Kushite ruler Pianki of the 25th dynasty, who used the same prenomen and had enough years of reign. Note the archaizing writing of the man of rank, seated on a chair without the crook and flail, on the left at the end of the name, at the bottom of the piece of linen. This is also a characteristic form of the early to middle 25th dynasty on statues, stelae, and coffins, as well as linen. This is an indication that the preferences for certain forms, perhaps imparted during scribal training, can appear on various media, suggesting scribes were perhaps not limited to association with a particular workshop, for example, stone carving, textile weaving, or coffin making. And finally, a shaft in the vestibule turned out to be the Baraize Tomb, now officially designated Tomb 18. The lower red arrow on the slide. The shaft was re-excavated and careful measurements made. Then, after measuring the 3 surviving Kersu sets, it was determined that the 4 coffins included in Baraize's discovery could have fit inside the tomb, confirming the location of his discovery. The choice of location was not only desirable to the Montu priests because of the proximity to the temple of Nebheptre, which was originally dedicated to Montu and Montu Ra, in whose cult the priests served at Karnak, but also because of the decoration on the vaulted ceiling of the Hatshepsut chapel. The sides of the vault are decorated with the first occurrence of the so-called Stunden ritual, which contains prayers and offerings to the night and day hours to facilitate the reawakening of the deceased as Osiris during the night and rebirth as the sun god in the morning to sail eternally with the god Ra in his bark during the day. The tympanum at the western end of the chapel depicts the night and day barks of the sun god, illustrating the ritual of the transit of the solar barks. Okay, you can't see it too well on the slide because of the damage to this part of the chapel. At a later time, it was turned into a Coptic chapel belonging to the monastery. And in the lower slide on the right, you can see some of the removal of figures that occurred during the long history of Hatshepsut's ownership of the temple. The outer lids of the Baraize Kersu coffins are decorated with the night and day barks of the sun god from the ritual of the transit of the solar barks. And you can see the top of the Kersu of Herasenes here, and details of the night bark on the left and the day bark on the right. The inside of the vaulted lids of the Kersu coffins have an outstretched figure of the goddess Nut down the center, flanked by figures of the night and day hour goddesses, with their accompanying texts from the Stunden ritual. The most beautifully executed version is in the side of the Kersu of Herasenes. It's apparently considered too risque to exhibit it, unfortunately. Herasenes also had a very well-crafted inner coffin. It would appear considerable effort and expense was put into her burial equipment. Thus, it's rather surprising that her canopic jars were just broken terracotta jars with the canopic packets stuffed into them and some resinous black goo poured over them and shallow saucers placed on the top as lids. This is an unusual phenomenon as well. So, and the ceramic experts are very excited by these jars and like to study them further for dating purposes. Unfortunately, her canopic chest is now in poor condition. By 2009, the Kersu of Nespekashuti VI, then in poor condition, had been transferred to the Carter magazine in Luxor and was undergoing further restoration. The wooden corner posts were from an earlier undocumented restoration. A view of the interior of the kersu shows metal bands supporting the planks of the vaulted lid from a previous restoration. The workmanship of the decoration is clearly inferior to that of Herasenes, although the selection of text from the student ritual is more complete. In the photographs, one can see metal bands screwed to the planks of the vaulted kersu lid to hold them together, and new wood for the corner posts. There's no record of when or by whom this restoration was done. In contrast to the poor workmanship inside his kersu coffin, Nespekashuti VI's outer osieriform coffin is very elegant. The angle at which the face mask is carved and placed makes it clear this coffin was meant to be viewed standing on the foot end during the funeral, as you can see from the slide on the left, where it was photographed standing up, as often depicted in vignettes and tombs and funerary papyri. The first reports of the discovery remarked on the elaborate bead net covering the bandages of Nespekashuti's mummy. It can be appreciated today on exhibit in the Luxor Museum on the mummy lying in its inner coffin. The inner coffin shows the same high quality of workmanship as that of Herasenes, so perhaps they were made in the same workshop. The outer osieriform coffin of Nespekashuti's uncle, Padi Amenet III, is very similar in style and execution. The face masks of the outer and inner osieriform coffins of Padi Amenet were covered in red wax instead of being painted as usual. This is a unique example in my experience, yet another interesting fact gleaned from the Baraize coffins. Unfortunately, at some time between when the first picture was taken in the 1990s, in the upper left of the slide, and the second one about 2011, the restoration work was performed on the face mask, and the missing areas of red wax were filled in with red paint, obscuring this unique feature. The broken covering of the face mask of Padi Amenet appears in the black and white photo taken in 1975, and a later photo from the 1990s clearly shows the red and black wax used to cover the face mask on the coffin. 3 of the burials from the Baraize tomb were intact, including an outer rectangular kersu coffin, enclosing osieriform outer and inner coffins, and finely wrapped mummies with bead nets. Thanks to an Antiquities Endowment Fund grant from the American Research Center in Egypt, we were able to X-ray all 3 mummies and CT scan those of Herasenes and Padi Amenet, both by 2014, having been transferred to the Fustat magazine of the National Museum of Egyptian Civilization. And here you can see how beautifully wrapped the mummy of Padi Amenet was, and what a nice bead net he has with a little fringe over his feet as he's lying, waiting to be X-rayed by the portable X-ray machine. The results were surprising. Both Padi Amenet III and Nespekashuti VI had their arms crossed over their chests and were holding a crook and flail in their hands, cementing the belief that the deceased was transformed into the god Osiris through the rituals performed at the funeral and the ritual texts and images painted on the coffins. Previously, it was thought that this arm position was unique to male members of the royal family until it appeared among mummies of non-royal persons in the Ptolemaic period. This is yet another important observation from the Baraize find. And you can see in the X-ray in the center, the crisscross pattern is his arms, and the CT scans on the left and right, you can see the blade of the flail and the hooked top of the crook in the CT scans on the right. Padi Amenet had a very well preserved and beautifully crafted canopic chest and canopic jars. They are now on display in the Luxor Museum. The carved limestone lids of the jars representing the 4 sons of Horus, who protected the internal organs removed from the body during mummification, did not have limestone jars, as is normally the case. Instead, the jars themselves were made of pottery covered with a white slip so they would resemble limestone, a less expensive solution for the deceased or his family, no doubt. However, this appears to be a relatively rare practice. Finally, after this long journey relocating, studying, and photographing the coffin sets discovered by Baraize in 1933, and rediscovering the tomb shaft where he found them in the vestibule of the Hatshepsut chapel at Deir el-Bahari, a complete publication of the coffin sets is in preparation and is expected to appear in the Deir el-Bahari publication series in 2028, 95 years after the discovery and more than 50 years since I first began the quest to locate and examine them. The expected publication date will also be 73 years after the death of Baraize himself. We hope he will finally be suitably honored for his discovery. And there is a big team of people who is going to participate in this: Egyptologists, archaeologists, and the photographs that were taken by the two photographers of the Polish Egyptian mission. I would like to thank the successive project directors of the Deir el-Bahari project, Policzki, Safransky, and Chitzik, for their help and support during this long research journey. Hatshepsut's temple at Deir el-Bahari has come a long way in the past 125 years since Howard Carter painted the complex, but it still has much to reveal to us as we continue working to understand it and preserve it for the future. And of course, I would also like to thank all the benefactors of the Deir el-Bahari project, without whose generosity work could not continue. Thank you very much for your attention and happy spring. I'll be glad to answer any questions or hear any comments from you.